Welcome to Honeybee Watch Symposia series. This is our third event and the last of 2023. I'm Steve Rogenstein. I'm your host and the behind-the-scenes producer and Honeybee Watch's project director. And I'm joined by Arrigo Moro, who is our science director. And today we'll hear from 4 experts who will share their research projects and experiences with free-living bees. And today in particular, we're going to talk about wild, a term that is laden with connotations and controversy. So the purpose of the Symposia series is manyfold. As I said, it's an international coalition. What we're trying to do is bring experts together to introduce them to one another, to start and spark dialogue, to introduce you to them and their projects, and you to one another. It's also a platform whereby we can hear about different experiences and perspectives related to free-living colonies and to discuss individual issues. So in the past, we spoke about monitoring. In September, we also talked about data sharing and data rights. And today, we're going to talk about wild. So today's title is Wild, Free-Living, Feral, Definitions for Consistency. And each of these terms has sparked numerous discussions, and we have not come to any clear conclusions. And so in this dialogue today, we really wanted to get to the heart of what is wild. It seems easy enough, but unfortunately it isn't. Today we'll attempt to unravel why and maybe work towards a clearer understanding and a clearer usage of this term. And through a couple of brief illustrations in no particular order, I'm hoping to introduce the complexity and some of the controversies. So to begin, we interchange wild living with free living. Some people use one of the terms and the other. They're interchangeable as we see it, but these are distinct from feral. So feral often refers to escapees. But in this context, if a swarm from a managed apiary settles into a tree cavity, for instance, while we acknowledge that it's a feral colony, until when is it? Does it ever revert back to being in a wild state? And who defines this process? And this is something that we have discussed interminably and have not really come to any kind of resolution. Additionally, as I said, we've been working with IUCN. And in 2014, they gave the data deficient label to Apis mellifera. And the reason was because there were complications between wild and domesticated. And, IUCN, they're working with animals across the globe. And when you're talking about a whale or a rhinoceros, yes, if seen in nature, it's wild. But in the case of honeybees, many view them as a species that's incapable of surviving without human interventions. And obviously, we challenge that. You can't control their reproduction. You can't control what they feed on or where they forage. And so this dichotomy of wild versus domesticated doesn't quite apply to Apis mellifera. Some people instead use managed as the opposite to wild, but again, we don't have a universally accepted definition here. So going back to wild, are we talking about a colony on an individual basis? Is it an entire population? And if we're talking about wild populations, are these self-sustaining, whereby they're isolated from managed hives that could cast swarms and possibly dilute genetics? And then what happens when a wild population exists, but not in its original geographic range? Is this considered wild also? Something else? Does it deserve protection? And then in common parlance, wild bees these days is often associated with solitary bees. And the question is, can honeybees be wild too, or do they beg a new descriptor? So this is just a couple of examples of topics that we've been pondering at Honeybee Watch. And while many have addressed these, for instance, Vincent Ambouy, I don't know if he's here today, or Francis Cordelot, they're drafting a glossary of terms, but there are no universal answers yet. And obviously within science, it's important for us to come to consensus so that we have consistent definitions, to know that we're talking about the same concepts and that population characteristics specifically are referred to universally. So that's a lot to process, but those are kind of the topics that we're going to discuss today. I could go on, but we're really here for our guests. Patrick recently got his doctorate from the University of Würzburg. So congratulations, Dr. Kohl. As many of you probably know, he's been studying free-living honeybees for several years with his colleague Benjamin Rutschmann under the tutelage of Jürgen Tautz. And together they've written many of the important peer-reviewed articles about these bees. In 2018, they definitively proved that wild-living honeybees are not extinct in Germany. And since then, they've researched bees in several German forests, as well as in Galicia, Spain. He's contributed to Honeybee Watch's reassessment of IUCN's red list status and is about to embark on new projects in the year to come. So stay tuned for what he's up to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction. Hello, everybody. I would like to share the lessons I learned from studying wild-living colonies in Germany on this topic of defining wild. So when we started our investigations, we had a clear premise that managed colonies, managed honeybees in general, and also specifically the honeybees we find in Germany, they're essentially wild animals. And I have a few arguments listed here. So on the one hand, I think that honeybee populations probably have always included both managed and wild-living colonies. We all know there's limited mating control of honeybee queens, so breeding is actually complicated. I think another important argument is that what we most benefit from in beekeeping is actually a behavior the bees had already optimized before beekeeping began. So their collective foraging for nectar and pollen is something we really don't want to change, because it's the basis for crop pollination, for example, and honey production. And the fourth point here is well illustrated by this picture. Everybody who has managed honeybees knows that when they are left unsupervised, they quickly revert to a natural state, which I call it. So they will sooner or later swarm, search for a cavity, move into a cavity, build a natural wax-comb nest, and they pretty much would behave as if this was the most normal thing for them. So this was the original perspective. Yeah, they are pretty much wild animals. The bit of breeding for gentleness and so on, which occurs, is not a big thing, so to say. And what results, the consequences for terminology are that maybe this often used dichotomy between domesticated and wild is really not suitable to describe our Western honeybees. Of course, we can understand that calling honeybees that live in a beekeeping hive, calling them wild, is also complicated, but clearly they're not as domesticated as our other livestock species. So, but what we can certainly do is, and this is what I think Hannes refers to as the phenotypic definition, we can refer to the current state of living of individual honeybee colonies and refer to them as either managed or wild living. And alternative for wild living, as Steve also said, as free living. I think they can be used interchangeably. And quite inclusive definition of what is wild living I have presented here. I used this in my thesis, is colonies that are ownerless, and most importantly, colonies that live in cavities they have chosen and occupied themselves. So yeah, this and with this this perspective that honeybee is not really a domesticated animal, my colleague Benjamin Rutschmann and I, we were pretty disappointed that there were almost no data, actually no data about the population stat of the honeybee in the wild in Europe. And we were very much inspired by the work of Professor Tom Seeley. And in 2013, Andrei Olexa, who is also here, he and his colleagues, they published a study showing that wild living colonies still exist in Poland. And this motivated us to do a first systematic search in Germany. And this is the paper Steve already mentioned, which we published in PHA in 2018. We went to 2 forest areas, used some different methods, but we found clear evidence for the existence of wild living colonies at pretty low densities, I have to say. So 1 colony in 7 to 10 square kilometers, but also living deep inside forests, so several kilometers away from the next beekeeper. And an important insight was that in Germany, the bees use the cavities of the black woodpecker as nesting sites. And these black woodpecker cavities are actually the only cavities that are large enough for honeybees in our managed forests. And there, in some forest areas, there are lists of woodpecker cavities with their geographic coordinates available. So this was a study system we could use to investigate these bees further. And really the first step for us was to clarify their population status, investigate the population demography. Do these colonies form a self-sustaining population of colonies, or are they, do they exist because swarms regularly escape from apiaries? And yeah, just a short note here. Here you see we used the word feral, and this was in 2018. And in that case, we really used it to avoid the term wild, simply as is. And we pretty much ignored the more specific meaning biologists have, which is animals that reverted to life in the wild after having been under domestication or management. So just as a note, certainly calling them wild living or free living would have been more appropriate here, because we were actually not aware of their population status yet. So an important thing to mention when is that the focus is on the population. And this is important because in apiculture, we really look at individual colonies. So we really treat them as if a colony was immortal, because we can exchange old wax comb with new wax foundation. We can, the bees themselves keep themselves young by replacing their queen. And this has the effect that we actually want to achieve 100% colony survival each year. And if there's some mortality, this is a problem. And we treat and do other stuff to mitigate losses. But for wildlife conservation, obviously the focus is not in individual organisms, but always populations. And in the natural populations, it's of course normal that organisms die, but they obviously also reproduce. And reproduction is mostly prevented in apiculture. So this is an important distinction, because it means that individual colonies actually don't have to be immortal, don't even have to live very long for the population to be stable. And yeah, this is another model here, how we look at the situation, what is our framework for investigating the population demography of wild living colonies. In any region we consider, we have a honeybee population, which Hannes already also said is a mix. So there's genetic exchange by the random mating of queens with drones in the area, but we can distinguish the cohort of managed colonies and the cohort of wild living colonies. And what determines the fate of the wild living colonies, on the one hand, is migration. So colonies can swarm, escape from apiaries, and become part of the cohort of wild living colonies. Of course, this migration can also go in the other way. I have this arrow here dotted because, especially in Germany, beekeepers don't install bait hives. They also are unlikely to catch swarms that on the move that come from wild-living colonies. So probably this migration is mostly an immigration into the wild-living population. And yeah, the other two variables that affect the fate of this group is the survival and reproduction of the colonies that are already wild-living. And yeah, the reproduction is difficult to estimate in field setting, but we know from studies observing unmanaged colonies in small hives that on average in temperate climate regions, honeybee colonies would produce 2 swarms per colony per year. And so what we needed to know to see whether this cohort is potentially self-sustaining, we needed to get to know the survival rates. And then our definition for the population level was, if we find that this cohort of wild-living colonies is self-sustaining,
you have 1 minute.
There are arguments to call this a wild population. And if it's dependent upon immigration, we would call it a feral population. So I here quickly show you the results of our population demographic study. We have the cavity tree occupation rate and the time course of the study from 2017 to 21 with winter times in gray and reproductive swarming seasons in green. And yeah, when we look in summer, we have always many trees occupied, but over winter in German forests, most colonies actually die. And yeah, we have found an annual survival rate of only a bit more than 10%. And for this population to be self-sustaining, each surviving colony would need to produce 8 to 9 swarms each year, which is clearly much more than they can do. And we can also calculate the annual rate of immigration that is certainly occurring. So each summer, we can expect about 70% of the colonies to be recent immigrants. And so this is the title of the publication. And we here again use the word feral, and then this time it's really informed use of the word feral because we know this is really a feral population that is not self-sustaining. Besides this population demography study, we have a study on the disease ecology comparing parasite burden between managed and feral colonies, and a study on limiting factors. You can see the links here. I just want to mention this, they're all open access. And Steve, if I have 1 more minute, I
Sure, go ahead.
Would really, thank you. Would like to highlight what is the most important, one of the most important questions now is what is really determining this high mortality in the feral colonies in German forests. So, and then on the one hand, we obviously have the environmental factors. There's certainly a lack of food. We have some evidence for that. There's certainly also a lack of suitable nesting sites. So it seems these woodpecker cavities are not perfect. There might also be problems of parasite pressure, although we didn't find evidence for that so far. But what is important to notice is that there might also be intrinsic factors. And on the one hand, problems with introduced subspecies that might not fit to the climatic and habitat conditions in Germany, but also the costs of bee breeding or domestication, which many members of the whole honeybee populations are subjected to. So coming to the first slide where I said my original premise was the honeybee is basically a wild species, regardless whether they live in beekeeping hives or not. I'm doubting this now, at least for the situation in Germany. And this is pretty similar to what Hannes suggested. There are several dimensions of how to look at it. There's the dimension of the phenotype, the behavior, ontogeny, of individual colonies, we can clearly say this is a managed colony, this is a pre-living or wild-living colony. But what we really don't know yet, or we have little information about, is the dimension of the genotype or the evolutionary history of our honeybee populations. We really know little about how much the genomes of our honeybee populations have been actually affected by artificial selection under beekeeping management. And an important note here, last note, is that there's not only this intended breeding, for example, low swarming rate, gentleness, etc., but there are probably also many unconscious factors involved in apiculture. And as Hannes said, also in Germany, it's like the wild living colonies only make up about 5% of the population. So most selection currently is artificial. Yeah, thank you. With this, I'm ready with my presentation.
Okay, I see, Patrick, that you're sparking questions. So there's obviously a lot to discuss, a lot to unpack here. Thank you for contextualizing population demography and how that's important and how it relates to wildness and the rest.